Welcome to Ed Talks. I'm Ed. I have today with me Craig Grooms, Chief Operating Officer for Buckeye Power, and Randy Price, and is it President CEO?
Yes, sir.
President CEO of Paulding Putnam. So we wanted to get together and kind of talk about what's going on with the PJM capacity auctions. I've talked about PJM in this series in the past, so people have got a little bit of familiarity of that and how it serves and what it does. But I don't think many people know what a capacity auction is, first off. So we want to try and make sure that we give an understanding of that. So that way people can understand how that impacts them. And then what our relationship is with Buckeye and how that could be impacted by these auctions and what that means for them on their bill. And so that's what I wanted to get together and talk to you guys about. Randy is President and CEO of another distribution cooperative, much like North Central and much like the Rain Medina. So that's why I wanted him to have a perspective there too, because I think it's important that this is not just a local issue, it's a statewide issue, and more than that, it's a multi-state issue. So you want to talk about a little bit about what a capacity auction is?
I will. So it's good that you've talked to your members about PJM. It's a regional transmission organization that is responsible for managing the high voltage power grid for a big region that includes the state of Ohio. It goes east to Washington, D.C. and New Jersey, all the way west to Cleveland, to Chicago. And so PJM, as a wholesale market under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, administers a capacity market. So they do a load forecast to project how much load they have to serve into the future, and then they procure generation capacity from all the power plant owners in the region that they manage. And so they conduct an annual capacity market to procure generation capacity to serve that load.
And so capacity would be the amount that one of those generators can produce, right?
That is correct.
Like if they were running 100%, this is what they could produce. But now they've made some changes, right?
They made some drastic changes, and actually this is probably the fifth time that they've made changes over the last 15 years or so. And so they have to continue to evolve as the states that they work with change their policies and regulations. And so they administer a capacity market, and when they procure the generation capacity, what we've seen most recently is that they are projecting, it's not a shortage of generation, but we're getting to the point where as electricity demand continues to increase and we are not building certain kinds of generation capacity, they're starting to be concerned. So with any kind of economic model, as supply goes down and demand goes up, prices start to increase, and that's what we're seeing most recently.
Right. So for Randy and I and our members, when we look at our biggest costs, the thing that we spend the most money on, that's our wholesale power, because we're a not-for-profit, and so we only charge enough to operate the local business, just enough to be able to pay everybody, buy our supplies, keep everything going, which means that everything else needs to go to pay for the energy that's powering the homes. Right, and so we kind of have the same model there. So there's a pretty big concern when we start seeing big changes in the wholesale power markets, because that means it's going to potentially have an impact on our biggest cost item that we are using to power homes for our members. So and Randy and I both are part of Buckeye Power on the board down here, so we get to hear about this stuff regularly and not necessarily the same for everybody else out there. So I don't know, Randy, what your perspective is.
And your loads are different than our loads.
Right.
Some of us are more heavily industrial versus residential, and we're a unique co-op. We're in Indiana and we're in Ohio both. So I don't know what we would do without our GNT. But it gets really complicated because we just did a cost of service study for all of our rates. And it's rather easy for us to figure out what to charge the member on our cost causers. But when it comes to the cost causers on the wholesale side of the business, we really count on Buckeye being our advocate when it comes to the way that those rates are designed, so we can forecast how it's going to impact our members.
Right. So when Buckeye's having to experience these changes, it becomes very critical for us as distribution providers that we're in tune with that. Now, fortunately, Buckeye does own and operate generating resources sufficient to provide for our load. And that's really important because with PJM and the way that it works, when we bid our generation in, we also get credit back for our load. So they offset one another, which means the latest changes, which cause some increases that I can ask Craig to talk about, don't impact us as much because of that relationship, and that's super important. We'll come back to that later. But you want to talk about what happened in this last auction?
Yeah, it really goes back to if you think of Buckeye Power, we've owned generation assets since the late '60s, that we make long-term investment decisions to own enough generation capacity to serve the co-op members in Ohio and Indiana. And so most recently, as I said earlier, PJM administers a capacity market. We have to participate because we're in this region. But like you said, we are insulated from a lot of the volatility that we've seen in the PJM capacity market. And so if Buckeye did not own this generation and the co-op members did not own generation capacity, they would experience annual volatility in their electricity prices based on what's happening at PJM. And so, for example, what they're projecting over the next couple of years, the co-op members will be isolated from that volatility. We think investor-owned utility customers and other retail customers, non-co-op customers, will see increases in their electricity price of about 20%. And so as we project out over the next 5 years, a lot of organizations are expecting a shortage of generation capacity, or at least a tight squeeze on capacity, where I think these increases in electricity prices will continue for the foreseeable future, and that we expect co-op members to be insulated or isolated from.
And there's different components when it comes to the wholesale power side of things, and one of them is capacity we're talking about now. So that's the part that's really got a lot of volatility in it right this second, because we are seeing a 3.5 to 4 times increase as of this year in those capacity prices. So that's pretty extreme. Now that's not saying the total bill is 3.5 or 4 times as high. It's just that capacity portion. And in fact, Buckeye's done a really good job on the other side, on fuel costs and trying to levelize that over time. So that's been really good for our members. But some of these things are a little bit out of our control, and that would be that prices. As Craig was saying, the benefit is when we own our own generation resources, the Cardinal plants, the Moan and Greenfield plants, those resources being available to us is super important. But we're kind of under fire right now, right? Because those are fossil fuel generating plants. And the EPA right now is pushing those to go offline. They've got a lot of new regulations that are coming down that we're actively participating in discussions about. It's a really good way to say that. But just trying to figure out ways to keep our generating resources online as long as possible to help insulate our co-op members from the volatility in those markets. And I know, Randy, that's important to your members just as much as it is mine.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what we would do if we didn't have all this base load or the base generation. I'd hate to even think about it, because how much is the Moan plant that's up in my area, how much has it been running more than what it was designed to in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a combustion turbine peaking plant designed to run primarily during the hottest times of the year and the coldest times of the year. So it still runs less than a baseload resource like a coal or nuclear plant, but it still is running more than originally intended. And we're seeing that across the PJM footprint and really across the country. These combustion turbines, called peakers sometimes, where they're running much more than most companies expected them to run, because as baseload generation starts to go away, we've introduced more intermittent wind and solar. These turbines are necessary to keep the grid reliable.
Yeah, so all of this really just goes to show that our relationship with our G&T is super important. Not just for reliability, because obviously that's a super important thing. We want to make sure that when you go to flip the power switch, it comes on, right? When our businesses need power, it's there, and jobs will be safe because there's reliable power. But also from a cost perspective, there's a huge advantage to owning our own generation and being able to provide for ourselves. And that's what rural America is all about. That's definitely what rural Ohio and rural Indiana is about too. So yeah, that's really the bottom line. as we look at what's happening from a regulatory perspective, which you all heard me talk about, as we look at what's happening on these capacity markets, the fact that we have a relationship with a G&T that has its own generation resources insulates us from some of these costs. And if we can maintain that and stave off some of the regulatory issues that are coming, then I think we're all going to be better off.
Agreed.
I would agree.
All right. Thank you guys very much.
Yeah, thank
It's been
you.
great for you to sit down and talk to me for a few minutes.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And we'll make
Yep.
sure that our members get